Hello the world, hello the internet, and hello of course to Jason Isaacs. We're back with a video on the royal prerogative, and yep, it's been a while, probably long overdue one of these, and certainly long overdue a haircut, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, we're back with the royal prerogative, and it's an interesting subject. It's perhaps more interesting in terms of what it's not rather than what it is, and there is a temptation for students to obsess on it and get dragged into the weeds, and I'm probably going to go a bit into the weeds on this, but while it is the sort of niche aspect of the course, it is still incredibly revealing in terms of how the government works, how Parliament is supposed to keep tabs on what the government is doing, and even nowadays what the courts think of this entire situation. So we're going to be looking into all of that when we get back after the messages. Don't touch that dial, and just remember, this is Paul Talks Politics. I'm Paul. I should have done this earlier, and I should definitely be talking about some politics, so I'll see you right after the intro. Don't touch that dial. And we're back. And it dawns on me that since I started doing this many years ago, other people have got on board the bandwagon, and so I need to be talking about commenting, liking, subscribing, commenting below the line, sharing it, and yes, do all of those things to boost the traffic. There, why not? But do let me know if you have any questions, if there's an area that you think you would like to see more coverage of, or somewhere where you think I could have been more clear, or perhaps have just overlooked. Let me know, because this is driven largely by you chaps, and it's all about working together to get the best possible outcome. So let's work together on the royal prerogative and what it is and what it isn't. So the first thing to say is that the royal prerogative obviously has ties with the monarch, and obviously therefore has a long and inglorious history. The key thing to think about really is the way in which it relates to certain key constitutional principles. And if we go back to, for instance, the Glorious Revolution in 1688, here's one I prepared earlier. That was essentially a big part of the process that saw the transfer of power from this unelected monarch to an emergent sort of parliamentary democracy. Now, 1688, there was nothing democratic about it, but we did see power starting to ebb from the monarch appointed by God or by accident of birth towards something that looked more like a representative government. And this is the process of the constitutional monarchy, and you should definitely look at my video on Parliament, on constitutional principles, to see how that works in practice. But basically what we've got is all of these powers that used to be exercised by the monarch being bundled up and handed over to this institution called the Crown, which isn't the monarch, and it's not quite Parliament, but it's essentially the government operating as that executive authority. And these are a set of powers that are designed for administration rather than governing. Now, if the government is going to govern, and again we're looking at how the government emerges as a sort of parliamentary democracy, for that government to be legitimate nowadays, it needs to put its public policy through Parliament. This is the principle of parliamentary democracy. Again, go back and look at your constitutional principles. But the key point here is, if the government is going to run the country, then it should present its policies to the democratically elected officials, that is Parliament, to take that policy and turn it into legislation. What that means is that if the government wants to govern, it should get Parliament to give it the laws that it needs to govern, to administer its policy, to take those policy ideas and turn them into something that's actually going to work in the real world. Critically, they should not, that is, the government should not be governing through prerogative powers. The prerogative powers are those strange little bits of power that the government uses in terms of organising its own administration. So things like, well, we'll see it in a second, things like appointing ministers and organising elections, those sorts of things. We'll come to that in a bit more detail in a second. But critically, we're not talking about running the country. This isn't about making laws that affect what you and you and I can do, but rather about how the government organises itself. So if the government is organising and running the country through the use of prerogative powers, then we've got a real problem here. Now, in fairness, there is much greater much greater latitude for the government to operate outside of parliamentary oversight in foreign affairs, because traditionally, Parliament is responsible for passing laws in the UK, and we can't pass laws in other countries. And so, in that instance, the government has much greater freedom to operate, and the royal prerogative, primarily in terms of its massive, insofar as it has a massive impact, that impact tends to be more obvious in foreign policy. In domestic policy, if it wants to do something that affects what you and I can do on the street, then it needs to change laws, and those laws obviously need to go through Parliament. But in terms of running foreign affairs, in terms of fighting wars, in terms of establishing diplomatic relations and making diplomatic treaties and so on and so forth, that effectively is covered by the prerogative powers. We'll see how that evolves in recent years. But in a sense, those of you who are doing America will see there's a clear corollary there, insofar as the president has much greater freedom to operate in foreign affairs than he does in domestic affairs. So there's a sort of analogy, or there's a parallel there with the United States. Not an exact one, but one that might help you understand what's going on. So while there is perhaps more freedom to operate under the royal prerogative in foreign affairs for the government in the UK, when it comes to domestic policy, the royal prerogative really doesn't work. The royal prerogative in domestic and within the UK is about organising government itself, appointing ministers, getting judges in place, running the courts, that sort of stuff. It's not about making law. It's not about changing what happens on the street. If you want to change what happens in the street in the UK and you're using prerogative powers, we've got a real problem. The government wants to change life on the street, wants to change how the civil state works. It needs to do that through laws. Those laws need to be passed by Parliament in the accepted way, because that is the principle of parliamentary democracy. So straight away, when we're looking at the royal prerogative, we can look at these two types of constitutional principles: the principle of parliamentary government and the principle of the constitutional monarchy. I hope that's clear. We will go on. We will return to these points as we go forward. So bear with me on this one. I'll be right with you. We're going to start our assessment of the prerogative powers by looking at essentially what the picture was like in 1979, which is essentially when modern politics starts, as far as you chaps are concerned. So in 1979, obviously with the emergence of Thatcher, and bear in mind, these powers hadn't really changed since the Second World War, we see the government having tremendous discretionary power in these particular areas: treaty making, deploying the armed forces, appointing ministers, civil servants, judiciary. Now, the dissolving of Parliament and the calling of elections, that is a very, very important prerogative power. And again, we're going to look at how that evolves over the next however long. But in terms of dissolving Parliament, that needs to be done by the Crown. And the way in which it works is the government the Prime Minister seeks permission from the monarch to dissolve Parliament, either to have an election or to have a prorogation or to have a break. But importantly, that is a power that the government does have. Now, again, this shouldn't change how you and I go about living our lives. It just means that Parliament essentially no longer sits. Remember that, because it's important. Civil service, honours passports, whatever. We're looking there at the administration of the state rather than the creation and the organisation and the day-to-day life of the civil state. All those laws that we live under. That's entirely separate. All of those laws go through Parliament. They're nothing to do with the royal prerogative. But here we go. We can see here, as we're in 1979, just as a starting point, this is what the royal prerogative covered. And we're going to see how this evolves, particularly under the Blair administration. That's where we're going next. So this is when it gets a bit more interesting. So, as I said, we get to 1979. Nothing really has significantly changed since the Second World War. And as we trundle through the entire Thatcher administration and into the Major administration, in terms of the royal prerogative, nothing really changes. Thatcher asserts her authority in the military domain with the invasion of the Falklands, but she calls a few elections at a time of her choosing. But there's no significant change in terms of the organisation of the state and the way in which the state governs. So no big changes in the prerogative powers, no big changes in terms of the legislative programme or anything like that. But remember that the prerogative powers should be about administration, not about governing. If you want to govern, you need to pass laws to change the shape of the civil state. And that all started in earnest with Blair. And I've chosen at this point to break it down into 3 sections. And I folded the coalition into the Blair thing because in many ways the coalition was essentially a continuation of the Blairite modernisation programme. So under Blair we get things like devolution, the Human Rights Act, the Constitutional Reform Act. Under the coalition we flirt a little bit with electoral reform, and then we have the Same-Sex Marriage Act. So there's very definitely a sense of modernisation running through particularly the Blair administration, even if it came unstuck in the aftermath of 9/11 attacks and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and then of course the financial crisis of 2008. So I'm not saying it wasn't without its problems, and that some of those problems were very, very significant, but there was still a sense of modernisation and an attempt to deal with some of the stranger atavisms, that is to say, things that were left over from previous generations in the British Constitution, and an attempt to bring it into something like a modern parliamentary democracy. And the problems raised by 9/11 and Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2008 crisis notwithstanding, all of that was relatively plain sailing compared to what happened after 2016. And we had Brexit in the UK and we had Trump in the United States, and basically we just had chaos. So we can break into a separate paragraph, into a separate section there. And we then move into the Johnson era where we try, or rather where the government tried to reassert control. And the section of that was through the prerogative power. So here we're looking at reform of the prerogative powers. Here we're looking at just chaos and management and some very bad mistakes made. And then here we're seeing the reassertion of those, apologies for my handwriting, but we're seeing those powers being reasserted. And we'll go on and we'll go into all of these in more detail, just so you understand how to understand the prerogative power, even if you're not going to write huge amounts of essays about it. Again, if you're writing essays and you find yourself discussing the prerogative power in great detail, then if you're not in undergraduate politics, then you're probably in the weeds, but you need to understand how it works anyway. And that's where we're going next. When we think about the constitutional reforms of the Blair administration, we tend to focus on the big and flashy things like the Human Rights Act, like devolution, like the Constitutional Reform Act, and other things like that. But there was also a sense, and I don't know whether it was by design or by accident, that we see a program whereby there's a sense that Blair tried to reassert parliamentary government. The odd thing being that Blair was never really a parliamentarian. He never really had a lot of time for Parliament. But nevertheless, when we look back and we look at his administration, we can see these 4 things that I think definitely assert or demonstrate a sense of an assertion of parliamentary government. Now, of course, in fairness, neither that nor that had much to do with Blair. But as I said, we can put them into that sort of general modernisation package, that sense that in this period we had people trying to modernise Parliament. Again, whether it's by design or by accident is perhaps moot. But here we go. The first of these is war powers. Now, prior to Blair, if the Prime Minister wanted to deploy military forces overseas, they would simply call up the Department of Defense and tell them to do it. There was no protocol attached to that. There was no check. There was no balance. Blair, however, decided that he wanted to join America in their escapades in the Middle East, and he was very much aware that this was not universally popular. Is perhaps the least contentious way of putting it. So what he did was he had not one, not two, but 3 votes in Parliament to demonstrate Parliament's support for these military expeditions / invasions / illegal occupations. Did he have to do that? No, he didn't. But in order to legitimize what was a very, very contentious action, he did it anyway. Now, you can turn around and say, well, all of those votes were very, very heavily whipped, and they were. Don't for a second think that Parliament was suddenly becoming neutral, independent, and expert. All of these votes were heavily whipped, and yet even so, there was significant rebellion in the Labour benches, and were it not for significant Conservative support, Blair's position would have looked perhaps a little shakier than it was. However, the Conservatives like a good fight overseas, and so they were more than prepared to lend their weight to this particular, or rather to these votes for Blair. Now, while those weren't constitutionally binding or in any way designed, if you like, to create a new constitutional convention, that is what they did. And by common consensus, the Blair decision to have these 3 votes in Parliament ahead of the military excursions in the Middle East essentially established a precedent such that going forward, a Prime Minister who wanted to deploy the military would be expected by Parliament to put themselves before Parliament and to seek parliamentary approval of that particular action. This is not a law. It is a new constitutional convention. And as far as I'm aware, it's the first new constitutional convention we've had since the time of Bagshot and Dicey, which is quite exciting if you geek out about constitutional conventions like weirdos like I do. But post the Iraq, certainly post the Iraq War, there has been an expectation that if the Prime Minister is going to advance some military expedition overseas, they will seek permission of Parliament before that actually happens. This article here that I'm linking off, that's from the Institute of Government. I'll make sure I link off to that in the notes. And if you get the chance to look at it, then I advise that you do. But it's going to be clearer if we look at how this works in action. The odd thing is that that doesn't actually happen until a little bit later in the presentation, or perhaps a little bit later in terms of history. But bear with us and we will get there. So that's military action. The next thing that we can talk about is the Constitutional Reform Act. And it's widely known amongst my students that I tend to be incredibly cynical, and I have a very low opinion of most laws that go through Parliament. This is the exception to the rule. The Constitutional Reform Act is a very, very solid and highly effective piece of legislation that did a great deal to consolidate and assert the neutrality, the independence, and the expertise of the judiciary. And I explain how that happened there. It took the final Court of Appeal out of the House of Lords and put it in its own institution. Now, did that make the courts more independent and more neutral and more expert? I don't think so. But it was definitely a bold statement of independence, if you like, demonstrating that it was no longer part of the legislature. We physically take the court out and we park it across the road. Big symbolic gesture. Perhaps more significantly was the stripping of the Lord Chancellor's judicial powers. Previously, the Lord Chancellor was essentially the highest judge in the country. Now those powers were taken away from them and given to the president of the Court of England and Wales and various other associations. But the key thing is that demonstrates, again, the independence of the judiciary by making sure that they are not answering to a political lord and master. And within that is that statutory obligation on everybody to respect the independence and neutrality of the courts. Now, I don't think that anyone was particularly concerned about the independence of the courts before going into this, but giving the courts that statutory footing and removing various bits of prerogative power, the ability of the Prime Minister to pick and choose which judges they want, and through the Lord Chancellor to put them in post. It was a highly significant symbolic gesture that demonstrated the independence and the neutrality of the courts. And again, the Judicial Appointments Committee, again, demonstrating that all of these appointments are being handled at arm's length from the political masters. A highly significant, if symbolic gesture, because again, I don't think that the courts were, I don't think you could challenge the neutrality, independence and expertise of the courts, certainly not in an A-level essay. Again, something you want to explore at university, you're more than welcome to do so. And there are some very, very interesting questions to answer. But in terms of the A-level, the impact of the Constitutional Reform Act may have been symbolic, but it was nonetheless highly significant, particularly the physical removal of the court from the building of Parliament into the building opposite, which is now, of course, the UK Supreme Court, and the stripping of the Lord Chancellor of any judicial function, and the creation of the Judicial Appointments Commission. It just really made sure that there could be no allegation or no suggestion that the Prime Minister, through the prerogative powers, was interfering with the neutrality and independence of the courts. And that, I think, is all I'm prepared to say about this at this time. If you've got any questions, put them below the line and I will deal with them as best I can. Let's move on to the next point. Again, you could argue that the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, the CRAG, was more symbolic than achieving real change. We had the Ponsonby Rule in effect, which was that the government would present any proposed treaty to Parliament for approval. And again, it just gave that a statutory footing, which reels back to a certain extent the prerogative powers. Now, it would be very, very difficult for Parliament to stop a treaty that the government wished to pursue or that the government wanted to put through, but they could make it difficult, they could be awkward, they could delay it. Inevitably the government's going to get its way. But the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act was, again, an attempt just to take these weird bits of constitutional history, the ability of government to make these treaties without having to run them past Parliament, and to just push back a little bit on the government using prerogative powers to shape public policy. Government's still very much in charge of this because Parliament is not really in a position to negotiate any treaties, and so you could turn around and say, well, look, this is just symbolic and it's a nicety, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But nevertheless, what we're doing is we're taking things that previously had been determined by prerogative power and putting it on a statutory footing, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. Why I've got a picture of Boris Johnson to demonstrate a 2010 bit of legislation, I'm not entirely sure. But it was a good photo and I thought I'd put that in there anyway. So again, we are seeing things that previously had been governed purely by prerogative power being given a statutory basis. So we had a degree of clarification and a degree of clarity coming to our constitution. And again, that has to be a good thing. Speaking of clarification and clarity, let's have an example of that military vote in action. And this is a very significant one. So in 2013, David Cameron wanted to put boots on the ground in Syria, again in support of American action, on this occasion in support of President Obama, who'd been drawing red lines about Assad's use of chemical weapons. And he basically asked if we would support him if he were to put boots on the ground. And Dave said, yes, of course we will. But, I kind of have to run that past Parliament now because that's how we do things in the UK. And he sort of turned around to Obama and said, look, this is no different from how you run things in the United States. If you want to put boots on the ground, you're going to have to run that past Congress because of the War Powers Act and because of the cost in terms of treasure and time and likely blood. What Dave didn't calculate was, or what he chose to forget, as he often did, was that his position was not remotely as secure as he thought. And when he brought the proposal before Parliament, the Lib Dems said, well, we're not having this. And of course that emboldened Labour to say, well, we're not having this either. And the Conservatives was really wobbling at this point. And yes, I did have to go and look it up because I couldn't remember myself. But it was 272 in favour to 285 against. And apparently that included 30 Conservative MPs. So the catalogue of Cameron catastrophes, here's another edition. He miscalculated this. So we had 272 in favour, 285 against, including 30 Conservative MPs, at which point that action was no longer viable, which was not ideal by itself, and obviously very bad news for Syria. But what happened next was even worse, was that Obama said, well, hang on a second, you've just lost your vote. And Dave went, oh, sorry. But of course now when Obama went to Congress to seek their support for military action, they said, no, we can't do this. How on earth can we how on earth can we endorse an action that has been rejected by one of our principal partners? And so that meant that Obama's opportunity to put a massive dent in al-Assad's use of chemical weapons was severely dented, and this was something that he had put his integrity and his career on the line in defence of. And he never forgave David. He never forgave Cameron for this. They never really cooperated again after this, and it represented a significant point in the UK-US relationship where things changed, and not for the better. David promised he'd be able to deliver the vote. He failed. He let Obama down. You could argue he let the Syrian people down. And the British relationship with America subsequently never got to the same point, because just when we were starting to try to rebuild, then we Brexit, and that went well too. So anyway, 2013, Cameron gets a surprise. Commons rejects his suggestion that we go into Syria in support of the Syrian people, and of course in support of our American allies. And not a good look, I think, is perhaps the most positive thing that one can say about that. One last thing before we leave the relative sanity of the Blair / coalition / Cameron administrations is to look at the calling and dissolving of Parliament. And once again here, this is where irony just comes and laughs its trousers off, because we're looking at something that was designed to create stability, and it was the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Now, I mentioned earlier that dissolving Parliament and calling elections is governed by the royal prerogative, and it is. It still is. The government gets to decide when to dissolve Parliament, whether that's at the end of a term or for a particular prorogation, or in order to then call a general election, which it also does by the prerogative power. Now, prior to 2011, this was done essentially on the nod. It was done by the exercise of the prerogative power. So if the Prime Minister fancied an election, they would go to the monarch and say, we quite fancy an election. We're going to invoke the prerogative power to dissolve Parliament and call an election, as long as that's okay with you, Your Majesty. And of course, in order to prevent a constitutional crisis, the constitutional monarch, because they are bound by the Constitution, would say, yes, of course, please do carry on. And the government would then dissolve Parliament, and if that was what they wanted, then they could call a general election. Now, The dissolution and dissolving of Parliament and the calling of elections is still essentially, or was under the 2011 Fixed Term Parliament Act, still governed by the royal prerogative, but they were tied into a formal 5-year timetable, which said the Prime Minister can only call an election after a 5-year term has been completed. So, yes, they can still call an election, but they have to now abide by this new timetable. Now, I've got into that in probably more detail than is necessary. Certainly, there's more detail than is necessary for an A level essay. But the main thing is that now the Prime Minister can call an election at a time. Oh, sorry, no longer call an election at a time that is convenient to them. If you look at the history of British elections, it's very, very rare that a government will allow a full 5 years to pass before they have an election. The only one I can think of off the top of my head is the Major administration from 92 to 97, because they just didn't want an election because they really realised they weren't going to win it. More often than not, a government will choose to call an election after 3 years or maybe 4 years at a time that they consider to be propitious to them. And go back and look at the history and you will see that that is very, very definitely the case. Under the coalition, Dave, again, demonstrating an extraordinary lack of foresight, or perhaps a lack of real planning, decided to tie the whole government to a fixed 5-year programme. So we had an election in 2010. The next one was going to be in 2015. And you know what? Yes, it was, for reasons determined by the Fixed Term Parliament Act. It also changed the threshold for a confidence motion, effectively, from 50% to 66%, to 2/3. And both of these things were done by Dave to consolidate and shore up the coalition. You know, any coalition is only going to be as strong as its weakest part, and if the Prime Minister can call an election at any time, that's going to weaken the coalition. If a coalition can be undone by a 50% vote, then that's going to weaken the coalition. So David here was thinking about self-preservation. How can I make sure that my government is as robust as possible? I know I'll pass a fixed term, or I'll ask Parliament to pass a fixed term Parliament Act that is going to tie that Parliament to a 5-year electoral schedule, and it's going to make it harder for Parliament to call a confidence motion. Yeah. Let's see how well that worked out. We did have a full 5-year term for the coalition, and it worked, with hindsight, surprisingly well. And that's when everything went wrong. After the relative stability of the Blair administration and the Cameron/coalition, we move into, let's put it this way, a more problematic time. And the exercise of the royal prerogative is front and centre of this entire programme. Now, we're going to start off by returning to military action. You'll remember that in 2013, Cameron wanted to put boots on the ground in Syria in support of the Syrian people and in support of Obama's commitment to do something about al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. Well, not saying that we can draw a straight line between that failure and the fact that in 2018 we're still having that debate. But in 2018, May, again in response to a chemical weapons attack, decides to launch a missile attack on positions in Syria. Now, the decision to launch the missiles, the decision by government to launch the missiles, was undertaken late on a Friday. It happened over the weekend, and Parliament was obviously not in a position to vote on that. So after the missiles landed, Parliament was brought in on the Monday and presented with this fairly farcical situation of being asked to ratify a decision that had not only already happened, but had also essentially flattened large chunks of Syria. Now, why does this matter? This matters because it demonstrates that while we kind of tried to reel in the use of prerogative power to run the country. Fundamentally, the government will get away with whatever the government wants to get away with if Parliament is prepared to let it. And while Parliament couldn't unmake these bombs fall, it could have made life an awful lot more complicated for May than it did. Although, in fairness, you could argue that life was complicated enough for May. And they let her get away with it. Was bombing the Syrian positions the right thing to do? Yeah, maybe. Did Theresa May play fast and loose with the rules concerning prerogative power in order to do it? Yeah. Could Parliament have been more awkward? Yes. But it kind of shrugged its shoulders and then, oh, well, not much we can do here, I suppose. Let's deal with the next aspect of Brexit chaos, because, of course, that wasn't far away. So here we see the interesting point here being the House of Commons asserting itself in 2013 and then in 2018 being asked after the event to sign off on a bunch of bombs that had already fallen. There's a technical phrase for that. It's kind of like taking the Michael, except maybe a little ruder. But Parliament let it happen. Again, arguably because it had other things to worry about. Like this. So, as I'm sure you're aware, in 2016 we had the referendum. And the result of the referendum was that the people voted 52% to 48% and change that they wanted to leave the EU. That unleashed an almighty period of rowing and ruckus that arguably is still going on now. Amongst all of that, Britain had to notify the EU that we were leaving. Now, that might seem like the simplest thing to do in the world. And so Theresa May took it upon herself to write a letter thus informing Europe that we had, obviously, had this referendum. They'd noticed that. They knew that. But also that we were going to be essentially signing our exit papers. And of course, there's a technical aspect attached to that. But Theresa May thought, well, I just want to get this. I do want to achieve something in the time I've got. And so she wrote to the European authorities, to President Tusk, saying, yeah, we're off. Thanks. Now, so far, so straightforward. They were foreign negotiations. Foreign negotiations, of course, come under the prerogative powers, generally, as do the signing and the recognition of treaties. And so the government thought that it was very much within its rights to do this. What they didn't anticipate was the furious reaction from the Remain crowd and attempts by the Remain crowd to slow, to obstruct, to obfuscate this process as far as they possibly could. So while the government argued, look, this is all covered by prerogative power, the Remain lobby, particularly fronted by a formidable lady by the name of Gina Miller, said, no, you can't do that. And you can't do that for two reasons. First of all, Parliament took us into the EU. And it did. Parliament drafted and passed the European Communities Act of 1972 that said we are now in the EU. And the thing about parliamentary sovereignty is that whatever Parliament makes or does can only be unmade or undone by Parliament. You know, whether you've had a referendum or not, whether the government has decided to trigger the Article 50, according to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, which is that Parliament can make, amend or set aside any legislation it deems fit, and that once made, no other entity can make, amend or set aside properly enacted parliamentary legislation, parliamentary legislation, nor can they make binding legislation of their own, and no Parliament can bind a future, blah, blah, blah. If Parliament has done it, only Parliament can undo it. That's the first point. And the second point was that we do have a number of rights enshrined in EU law, and if you're going to extricate us from the EU, then that's going to change our law. And if you remember correctly, you can't, sorry, that's going to change our law, it's going to change our rights, and you can't be changing our rights and our laws with prerogative powers. And so on both fronts, both the idea that Parliament took us in, Parliament has to take us out, and you can't go around changing our rights and our laws by prerogative power. On both fronts, the Remain campaign cried foul. They said you cannot do this, and the courts, as it happened, agreed. And so in Miller 1 versus the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, the government was told in no uncertain terms that it had broken the law, that it had acted unlawfully by triggering Article 50 unilaterally. So again, there we see the government trying to use prerogative power when it shouldn't. And on this occasion, it didn't try to do anything about it. It put its hand up, said, yeah, okay, fair enough, and instructed Parliament to write the Notice of Withdrawal Act, which of course it did, and then that went through, and everyone went, yeah, okay, I guess we're leaving the EU now. But you couldn't do it through prerogative powers. That was the main thing. And as soon as the government said to Parliament, okay, give us the act to leave the EU, they went, yeah, of course, here you go. And then we were able to leave, having created the appropriate legal mechanisms to do so. I hope that makes sense. We will revisit this again at a later date. Perhaps as a response to the chaos of the May administration, or perhaps because it was just the way he rolled anyway, Johnson decided to reassert the power of the executive, and if he could do that through the use of prerogative powers, then he wasn't going to be shy of doing so. So, we talked earlier about Miller. Well, she came back again with Miller too. Now, we did say that dissolving Parliament, putting Parliament in abeyance, if you like, just telling Parliament to go home, is one of the powers of the royal prerogative. Normally it would be done for any one of a number of reasons: to prepare for an election, or to prepare for the state opening of Parliament. Johnson did it because he was struggling to get his bill through. He was struggling to get his Brexit deal through Parliament, and so essentially Johnson dissolved Parliament for 5 weeks. He did go to the Queen to seek permission, and it is alleged that he misrepresented his case to the Queen, which, with hindsight, certainly didn't help him. It became evident that essentially Parliament had been put on ice for 5 weeks for no real administrative reason, for no governance reason, other than to allow Johnson to go away and to work out how he was going to deal with Brexit. Now, you could argue that that was the only way it was going to happen, but even if that was the case, you still can't just dissolve Parliament for 5 weeks without due cause. And again, we see here Parliament rolling over and letting it happen. Parliament just said, yeah, whatever, we'll take 5 weeks break, and off they went. And it was left to Cherry in Scotland and Miller in the UK to seek redress through the courts and say, no, you can't do this. This is not a legitimate use of the royal prerogative. Now, Parliament was the one that was actually affected by this. They were told to go home. They were told to pack up and go home, but they did nothing about it. And so ultimately, it was left to concerned citizens to take a case of judicial review to the courts, saying that this action was unlawful. And over several weeks, the legal arguments in Scotland and then in London went backwards and forwards, first of all, as to whether or not the courts had the right to look at this particular question. That is this actually justiciable? Had a law been broken, or had somebody acted unlawfully? And then sorry, they had to ask whether or not this was an area in which they could look into that question of lawfulness. And then having established that they could look into this question of unlawfulness, they then had to decide whether or not somebody had acted unlawfully. And the answer to both those questions turned out to be yes. And to cut a long story short, the courts turned around to Johnson and said, you have acted unlawfully. Your use of the royal prerogative was not lawful on this occasion because you have prevented Parliament doing its lawful thing, which is legislating, scrutinising, holding you chaps to account. That's what Parliament has to do. And you have told it to stop doing that without any good cause. And that is not lawful. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's all I'm going to go into at this point. The key point that you need to get across here is that Parliament is allowing the executive to use prerogative power in a way for which it was not intended. And Parliament is doing nothing about it. It's just allowing that to happen. It's allowing the executive to exercise dominance over Parliament. And it was only the actions of citizens that made it abundantly clear to the government that it had acted unlawfully and that Parliament needed to be recalled. And that's exactly what happened. So again, we come back to that point that the government will be prepared to use prerogative power, and it will be prepared to stretch that use of prerogative power, and Parliament, as often as not, is just going to go, yeah, whatever, and let it happen because, of course, it's not neutral, independent and expert. They didn't, on this occasion, take into account the actions of these concerned citizens who were sick to the gills of the whole situation, and particularly of Johnson's use of parliamentary procedure and administrative device to try to frustrate the proper functioning of government and that relationship between government and Parliament, and of course that being parliamentary government, and then the whole idea of parliamentary democracy, the idea that Parliament is operating in the interest of the people. If Parliament had been acting in the interest of the people, it should have withstood the attempt of government to shut it down. It didn't, and people were not happy. So that's the first instance of Johnson's run-in with the prerogative power. Now we're going to go back and have another look at the dissolution and calling of Parliament. So we talked there about the Fixed Term Parliament Act. We saw then in 2017, going back to May, that we had a general election. Now, you'll remember that we had an election in 2010, then we had an election in 2015. Now, the last time I checked, 15 plus 5 is not 17. So how is it that we had an election in 2017? Well, the reason is because Theresa May was finding Parliament ungovernable, and she wanted a bigger majority, so she called a general election. She asked for that dissolution from Parliament. That needed a 2/3 vote in Parliament. She got it. We had a general election, and of course her majority went down. She was running a minority government and needed the support of the Democratic Unionist Party to achieve a very, very flaky and flimsy majority. Now, she resigned in 2019, in came Johnson, and he wanted to shore up that parliamentary majority. He was pretty convinced that if he purged Cabinet of Remainers and if he purged the party of Remainers, that he could go to the people and get a better deal or get a better majority. Get Brexit done election. We all saw the Love Actually or Vote Actually or whatever, Brexit Actually party political broadcast. So Johnson went to Parliament and asked for an election, and they said no. They did not give him the 2/3 majority that he needed. I think it came in about 52%, 56%. The Labour administration at that point, under Corbyn, didn't particularly want a general election either. And so twice Johnson came to Parliament and asked for dissolution, and twice Parliament refused to give it. So Johnson went off and said, well, obviously I can't get my 2/3 majority to dissolve Parliament. What can I do? Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll come up with a new law. And so he came up with the Early Parliamentary General Election Act of 2019, and he brought that to Parliament, which basically said we're going to ignore the 2011 Fixed Term Parliament Act, because of course Parliament can make amend or set aside any legislation it deems fit. And we're going to have a special election in 2019. And that passed, ironically, by more than 2/3. But hey, look, it was crazy times. So here we see again the government trying to assert royal prerogative power, Parliament resisting, and then the government essentially going around the corner and coming up with a cunning plan to get its will anyway. So, yeah, that was odd. But what was really odd was next, when Parliament passed the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act, which essentially said, right, we're going to get rid of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, so we can forget about that. That's gone. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that Miller 2 never happens again. So here we say, look, only the government can dissolve Parliament and the courts cannot get involved. So if the government prorogues Parliament again, if the government dissolves Parliament for whatever reason, the government gets to do that. The courts cannot step in. This is not the jurisdiction, literally, of the courts. Clearly, Johnson thought he was going to be around much longer than he was, and presumably he thought that he'd get to dissolve Parliament a few more times and prorogue Parliament a few more times than he eventually did, because obviously he was out on his ear very shortly after that. But again, here we see the government reasserting control, making sure that those attempts to rein in the exercise of prerogative power are going nowhere. And instead, the government can call elections when it wants. The government can dissolve Parliament, can prorogue Parliament, can put Parliament on ice for as long as it wants, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Now, obviously, Johnson was giving his marching orders less than a year later, and we moved into the Truss and the Sunak administration, whereby practically nothing was achieved of any great significance. And we're now in Starmer, and we haven't seen that recourse to the royal prerogative again. So just to recap, we have that concept of the constitutional monarch. Yes, ma'am, you can look at the crown, but it's not yours anymore. It belongs to the state. And this crown here really is a representation of the power that you used to have that is now held essentially in trust by the government on behalf of the state. We saw how that went through these three different stages. We had Blair with his modernising project. We had the post-Brexit chaos, and then the attempt of Johnson to try to reclaim some of that authority through use/misuse of the royal prerogative. Here are the Blair and the coalition reforms. We've got the votes on military deployment. We've got the Constitutional Reform Act that insulated the judiciary from the exercise of prerogative power. We've got the CRAG, which the Constitutional Reform and Government Act, not a huge issue, but again, symbolic but significant. Fixed Term Parliament Act, very significant until Johnson gets rid of it. And overall, I think what we've got here is a sense of modernisation. The idea that the government should be operating through Parliament as far as it can. We'll allow it some degree of discretion in foreign affairs, but Parliament has to be involved because we have got parliamentary government, and if we want a parliamentary democracy, government has to be answerable to government has to be answerable to Parliament, and if the government is going around using the prerogative power, then it's not really going to be particularly answerable to Parliament. Brexit in May, strain and misjudgment. They misjudged Article 50 terribly. Yes, they had an election in 2017 using the Fixed Term Parliament Act, but that wound up weakening her position significantly, and so yeah, it was just pandemonium. And then of course we've got Johnson trying to reassert control over Parliament through the use of prerogative powers. First of all by dissolving Parliament, then by trying to call a general election, not getting it, using his dominance of Parliament to create first to pass an early election bill in 2019, and then passing the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act 2020 that did away with the royal prerogative, with the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and made sure that next time he decided to dissolve Parliament unilaterally, nobody could seek the courts authority to get him to stop. Deliberately, I think, trying to reassert power through the role prerogative. Now, look, again, if you're talking about the role prerogative in your essays, be careful. It's a small niche part. It's the bit of government activity that doesn't necessarily need to go through Parliament. If the government is using prerogative power to shape our lives and what's happening on the street, then we have a real problem. Prerogative power should be administrative. And if the government is going to change life on the street, then that needs to go through Parliament, recognising those principles of parliamentary democracy and parliamentary government. Yes, the government has a majority. Yes, it can overrule the objections of the House of Lords. Yes, the government MPs do what they want. So, there are questions about that neutrality, independence and expertise. But at least it's not the prerogative. I hope that's made sense. Do let me know if you've got any questions. Do let me know if there's anything you want me to cover in any other presentations. Do like and subscribe, and do keep enjoying your politics. And get me those questions, and I look forward to answering them. Like and subscribe, and see you all very, very shortly. Take care now. Goodbye.